to the sector of
Ernesto,
culture there.
vous avez la parole.
Ernesto, you have the floor.
Alors, nous attendons que Ernesto
We're waiting
se
for
connecte,
Ernesto
quelques
to
petits
connect.
soucis
There's a
techniques.
few little
Mais
technical
donc, en
problems.
attendant, j'ai dit qu'il y avait la deuxième
Waiting for
personnalité.
him, there's a second
Donc,
eminent figure I'd like to invite to
cette
take the floor
fois-ci
today.
aussi,
So
donc,
now I'd like to
donner
give
donc déjà
the floor
la parole à
to
Son Excellence
Her
Madame
Excellency,
Sahar
Madame
Bassiri,
Sahar
ambassadeur,
Bassiri, the
délégué
ambassador of the
permanent du
permanent
Liban auprès
delegation
de
of
l'UNESCO,
Lebanon at UNESCO.
partenaire de ce deuxième débat,
Who's the partner of
à
this
dire
second
quelques mots
debate,
introductifs.
and she will give us a few words
Madame
of
l'ambassadeur,
introduction. Madam
c'est à vous.
Ambassador, you have the floor.
Thank you. Can you hear me? Thank you very much, Lazar. Bonsoir à tous. So good to see you all. Okay, I'll take advantage of having Arabic translation, Lazar, and can I say a few remarks in Arabic? Is it okay?
Avec la technique, on a la translation, l'interprétation en
I'd like
arabe?
to check with the technician. Do we have Arabic interpretation?
I think, Ambassador, it seems it's only, I'm sorry, it's only English and French.
It's fine. Okay. It's fine. That's fine. That's fine. That's fine. Okay. Again, thank you very much and good evening. I'll be very brief. I would like to give time more to the speakers today. I have 2 points to make, one about UNESCO and the other about the soldiers of culture in Lebanon, about you all. First, I would like to thank UNESCO for its rapid response to Lebanon's appeal for solidarity after the Beirut blast, and thank Director General Azoulay for visiting Beirut and launching her initiative that she called Beirut, for Beirut, to support education and culture in Lebanon in its two phases, heritage and creativity. And of course, I'd like to thank Assistant Director General Otoni. He will be, I think, with us in a few seconds, and all who works, hello, and all who's working with him, Lazar, also for organizing these debates within the Beirut initiative that aims mainly at listening to Lebanese voices, saying their priorities and needs, and within this framework to try help them in the recovery process. And to you, directors and curators of museums, owners of art galleries, and all soldiers of culture in Lebanon, the damage that hit your spaces and the cultural sector in Lebanon is immense. Not only because the destroyed neighborhoods host a large number of freedom and creative spaces like museums, art galleries, and workshops and others, but also because it came to add to the harm caused by the unprecedented financial crisis and the consequences of the corona pandemic. Despite all that, you never shy away from taking initiatives. Despite your pain, your losses, unending challenges, and the draining daily hardships, your determination to keep going is exceptional. It is a source of pride for all of us Lebanese, and an incentive to work with you and wherever we can, so that our Beirut will rise again, and our Beirut will remain a local treasure of diversity and a regional beacon of creativity and an international symbol of dialogue through art and culture. Thank you.
Je vous remercie,
Thank
Madame
you
l'ambassadeur,
very much,
pour vos mots
Your Excellency,
introductifs,
for
pour
these
votre
introductory
appel à
remarks,
la
and
mobilisation.
for your call to mobilize.
Donc l'UNESCO a d'ailleurs lancé un appel
UNESCO has
de fonds
launched
Beirut
an appeal
à la communauté internationale
funds, the
en vue de
Beirut
faire de
appeal to
l'éducation,
the
de la
international
culture et
community
du
to
patrimoine
make
les
education,
piliers
culture and
de la
heritage the
reconstruction.
pillars of
Donc nous
reconstruction.
souhaitons de nouveau vous adresser
And
toute
so
notre
we would
compassion,
like to
notre soutien et le
thank
témoignage
you and
de notre
to offer our
solidarité.
support
Nous sommes
and our
mobilisés
solidarity.
aux
We
côtés
are
du peuple libanais.
mobilized together
Et
with the
donc justement,
Lebanese people.
le sous-directeur général,
And
Monsieur Otonné,
so the Assistant Director
je
General,
voulais
Mr.
lui passer
Otone,
la parole,
I'd like to
lui
give
qui
him
s'est
the
rendu
floor because he went to
personnellement
Beirut
à
personally
Beyrouth pour évaluer les dégâts
in
sur
order
la
to
culture,
assess the
afin qu'il nous
damage
dise
caused to culture,
un mot
so that
introductif
maybe he could tell
avant
us
que
a
nous
few
poursuivions le
introductory
débat.
remarks
Cher
before we
Ernesto,
continue
vous
our
avez la
debate.
parole.
Mr. Ernesto, you
Merci
have the
Lazare.
floor.
Tout
Thank you very
d'abord,
much,
je voudrais
Lazar. First of
vous
all,
dire désolé.
I'd like
Malheureusement,
to
j'étais
apologize. Unfortunately,
sur une autre réunion,
I
pour un autre
was in
système,
another
et
meeting
donc
in a
entre
different
système et
system, and
système, il y a
so
toujours
there
un
was a bit of a
décalage. Je
glitch
suis
between
désolé
the different
de ne
systems,
pas
and I was a bit
avoir
late.
été au
I'm
début.
sorry for not being here at the beginning of the meeting.
Chers amis, parce qu'en fait, normalement, on dit toujours les discussions,
Dear
mesdames et
friends,
messieurs, mais là,
because of course we usually say
je vous
ladies and
considère
gentlemen, but
tous
here I
très
consider
chers
you
amis.
all as being my
Excellence, bien
very
sûr,
dear
Madame
friends.
l'ambassadrice.
Your Excellency, of course,
Et je vais
Madame
répéter que
Ambassador.
l'ambassadrice et Lazare ont déjà dit, au nom de
And I'll
l'UNESCO,
repeat what
on vous souhaite la
Madame
bienvenue
Ambassador and Lazar
pour ce
already said. I'd
deuxième
like to
ResiliArt.
welcome you in the name of
J'ai eu
UNESCO for this
l'opportunité la
second
semaine
meeting.
dernière
I had the
de
opportunity
modérer
last
dans les
week to
chaussures de
moderate
Lazare avec le monde
the first
artistique,
debate
avec les créateurs.
with the artistic
Et
world, of creative
effectivement,
world of
comme je le
Beirut.
disais la semaine
And
dernière,
as I said
nous avons
last
pu, avec
week,
la directrice générale, le 27 août dernier,
we were
aller
able
sur
to
place à
go to
Beyrouth
Beirut
pour
with the
voir, pour vous
Director General on the
écouter,
27th of
prendre
August to see
aussi
the situation on the
en
ground, to
direct
listen to
le
people there,
dégât
and to see the
qui s'était
damage that has
produit
been
après
caused to the
les deux
city
blasts.
after the two
Mais surtout,
large explosions there. But
ces derniers
above
jours, avec
all,
les
these
incendies qui sont
last
répétés la
days
semaine
with the
dernière et cette
repeated
semaine,
fires last week and this week
on
in
est dans une
Beirut,
situation où
we're in a
vraiment,
situation
c'est pas seulement des mots comme
where
en ce moment
it's
on
not
est avec
just words.
les Libanais dans ce moment très difficile.
We are really with
Et
the Lebanese people in
c'est
this very
incroyable parce qu'on
difficult
parle
moment.
avec vous et
And it's incredible because
on
we're
sait l'histoire
talking together with you here. We
très
know
lourde
the
que vous
very
avez, que
difficult
vous
history
portez,
of your
et
country,
cette
this history
force
that you
d'un
carry,
mot que nous utilisons qui apparemment n'est pas le mot correct
and
à Beyrouth,
of this
tout du moins, c'est la résilience.
this word resilience that we
donc,
use,
pour
which
nous,
is
c'est
maybe
très
not the right
important de vous
word
avoir.
in Beirut,
On
but
a
it's
voulu
very important to have you here. We
un
wanted
deuxième
to
débat, rien que ce
devote a
musée et
second
les galeries
debate to
qui ont été
museums
très
and
affectés.
galleries because
C'est la
they've been
première fois que
very
fait les deux.
impacted.
Normalement, soit on travaille avec les
It's the first time
galeries,
we
soit on
brought these
travaille
two
avec les
things
musées.
together. So usually
Je
we
croyais
either
que
work with museums or galleries.
pour le cas de Beyrouth, c'est important
But
de
for
partager
Beirut, we thought it
la
was
double
important
expérience,
to
de
share
travailler avec des
this double
collections, de travailler
experience,
avec des artistes
working
visuels,
with
des
collections,
photographes.
with visual
Et donc, nous
artists, with
pensions que c'était
photographers. And
important
so we thought it would
de
be
pouvoir
important
recueillir aussi
to be able
vos
to gather
expériences, vos
the
suggestions,
experiences
vos
that
demandes
you have, your
pouvoir mieux
suggestions, your
élaborer
requests,
certains
to be able
projets
to
que nous
better
voulons
design the
appeler
projects that we would like
à travers vous,
to
à travers
set
la
up,
société civile, les
that we were able
ONG,
to set
et
up
pouvoir
together with NGOs and civil
venir
society in
en
order
aide, mais à
to
partir non
come
pas
and
des
help
grandes
you,
idées qu'on pourrait avoir ici à partir de Paris, mais plutôt
but
par les
not based
nécessités que
on
vous avez
ideas that we might
et
have here
surtout
in
par les
Paris, but
mécanismes
on
qu'on
the
doit trouver
needs that you have on
ensemble
the ground, and
pour
also
s'assurer
to try and
que
identify the
les
mechanisms
financements
together, to
qui
identify them
pourraient
together, to try
arriver
and find
aillent également
financing
à vos
that could
besoins et à vos
help
nécessités. Je
and that
veux
would
tout
correspond to
d'abord
your needs
remercier
and
l'ambassadrice du
your
Liban qui nous fait l'honneur
necessities.
d'être parmi nous.
I'd like to thank the
Remercier
to
chacun
Lebanon,
d'entre vous, les
who's
panélistes, qui ont
graced us with her
accepté cette
honor being
invitation
here today. I'd also
et
like
qui
to
vivent en
thank
ce
our
moment des
eminent
instants
panelists
très
for
difficiles.
being
Que
with
vous
us today and
soyez
who
à
are all
Beyrouth,
going
au
through very
Liban,
difficult
ou que
times,
vous
whether
soyez
you are in
dans
Lebanon
dans
and
la
in
diaspora.
Beirut or if
C'est
you
sans
are in
doute un
the
moment très
diaspora.
dur.
It is surely a
Permettez-moi
very
également
difficult
de
moment for
remercier tous
you.
les
Let me
auditeurs de la
also
semaine
thank
dernière, de cette
all
semaine et celle que
the
nous allons avoir la semaine
audience from
prochaine,
last week and also those
qui
who will
sont
be with us
connectés à
next
travers
week
le monde.
who are
Comme vous le savez,
connected
l'UNESCO
around the world
a lancé
online.
cette
As
campagne
you know,
internationale
UNESCO
d'Ibeyrout
launched this
pour
international
aider à la
Beirut
reconstruction
campaign
du
in order to
patrimoine,
help
mais aussi, et
rebuild
ça c'est très
Lebanese
important,
heritage, but
au
also, and this
relèvement
is very
de la
important,
culture,
to
de l'éducation dans la capitale
boost education and
libanaise.
culture in
Je
the
suis
Lebanese
persuadé que ce débat va
capital.
permettre
I'm
d'en
persuaded
savoir plus
this
sur la situation
debate will
des
allow us
galeries
to know
d'art
more about
suite
the
à
situation
ces
of
événements
art galleries
catastrophiques
and
et
museums
à
in
la
Lebanon after
succession
these
d'événements
catastrophic events
que
and
vous
the
êtes
events
que vous êtes en train de vivre.
the
Enfin,
events
je
that you
saisis
are
cette
going through
opportunité
right
pour
now.
vous inviter
And I'd like to seize this opportunity
pour le troisième débat que je vous disais le jeudi prochain,
to invite you as well to the
le
third
24
debate
septembre, à la
next
même heure,
Thursday on the 24th of September at the same
pour
time
parler du patrimoine bâti.
to speak about
Je
the
vous
built
remercie une fois de plus
heritage.
et
Thank
croyez-nous
you
que nous
once
sommes de tout
again,
cœur
and believe me
et
that we
nous
are
ferons tous les efforts.
wholeheartedly with you, and we will do everything in our power.
La semaine prochaine, nous envoyons une coordinatrice
And
générale
next week we
pour être en
are
charge de
sending
lecture
a
et de pouvoir
coordinator
travailler directement avec chacun d'entre
to be able
vous
to work
et
directly
que
with
notre
each and every
bureau
one of
soit
you
au service
so
de
that
vos
our
besoins,
office
de vos
can be
attentes,
at the service of your needs, of your expectations,
de cet espoir que nous portons
of
tous
your hope, and the hope that we
sur
all
la
share
possibilité de travailler pour le Liban
to be able to work together for
pour les
Lebanon
Libanais. Merci
and
beaucoup,
for the
Lazare.
Lebanese people. Thank you very much, Lazar.
Merci beaucoup,
Thank
Ernesto,
you very
pour ces
much,
mots
Ernesto, for these
d'introduction
introductory remarks
et pour avoir rappelé le
and for
contexte
having
de la
reminded us of
réflexion et
the
de l'engagement
context of this
de notre
debate and the
organisation.
involvement of our
Mesdames et messieurs qui
organization
nous
in this
écoutez,
context. Ladies and gentlemen who are listening to me
oui, les musées
right
et les
now,
galeries
yes, museums and
d'art jouent un rôle
galleries
essentiel
play
dans
an
nos sociétés.
essential
Et
role
comme
in
vous
our
savez, à l'UNESCO,
societies. And
nous
as you know,
avons
here at
la
UNESCO,
recommandation de
we have
2015 de
the
l'UNESCO sur les
2015
musées et les
recommendation on
collections
museums and
qui rappelle
collections,
toute
which
l'importance du rôle des
remind us
musées
of
à la
the
fois
very important
dans la
role of
préservation
museums
du patrimoine,
for
dans
preserving heritage on the
l'éducation,
one
la
hand,
recherche
for
et la
education,
communication,
research and
et aussi
communication,
dans le
but
développement
also for
économique
the
et
development, the
social.
economic and
Et quant aux
social
galeries
development.
d'art,
And when
elles
it comes to
permettent aux
art
artistes
galleries,
de
they
mieux se
allow
connaître
artists to
et de
know
vivre de leur
themselves
métier.
better,
Dans
to
ce
be
sens,
better
elles
known, and to be able to
contribuent
live
à la
from their
créativité
profession, and thus they
et au
contribute to
développement
creativity
des
and
sociétés.
to the development of
Alors, les galeries
society.
d'art et les musées
Art
situés
galleries
à
and
Beyrouth
museums in Beirut
témoignent de la place du Liban
bear
dans l'histoire
witness
de l'humanité,
to the
de
place
son rôle
that
en
Lebanon
tant que
occupies in the
carrefour
history of
culturel,
humanity as a
de la
crossroads
richesse,
of
de la
cultures,
culture
of the
locale
richness of
et de
local
la
culture
créativité,
and
car
of local creativity.
bénéficiant d'une longue tradition de
Lebanon has a
pluralisme et
long
d'ouverture,
history of
le
pluralism
Liban,
and openness,
que l'on sait comme un creuset culturel, a
and
toujours
Lebanon
joui
has been
d'une
a
liberté
cultural
d'expression
melting pot,
parmi les plus
which
développées
has
dans la
some of
région
the
et
greatest
ainsi
freedom of
a vu
expression in
naître
the
une
region,
lignée de
and has thus
brillants hommes de
seen a
culture
whole
et
line
artistes.
of
Mais bien
wonderful
avant les
artists and
événements
culture.
catastrophiques
But long
du
before the
4 août,
catastrophic
le
events
secteur
of the 4th
culturel
of
de cette
August,
ville
the
dynamique qu'est
cultural
Beyrouth
sector of this very dynamic
était
city
déjà
that is Beirut
confronté
was already
à des défis
confronted
importants,
with
comme l'a
very
rappelé
important challenges,
Madame
as
l'ambassadeur
Madame
dans son mot
Ambassador has
introductif.
reminded
Et les
us in
stigmates
her
des années de
introductory
guerre
remarks,
civile
and the
ainsi que la
wounds of
crise
years of civil
économique et
war as well
sociale
as the
ont
social and
durablement
economic
marqué le
crisis
peuple
have
libanais.
marked the
Puis est
Lebanese
survenue
people.
la pandémie de
And then they
COVID-19
were hit by
qui a
the
frappé le
COVID-19
monde entier
pandemic, which
avec
hit
les effets
the
qu'on
whole
connaît.
world with the consequences that
Et à
we
cet
all know.
égard, je souhaite mentionner,
And so I'd also
avant de
like to
commencer le débat,
mention,
quelques données,
before
par
I open the
exemple, qui
debate,
étaient
a
issues
few
d'un
figures
rapport que
from
l'UNESCO a
a
produit pendant
report that UNESCO
cette
produced
période forte
during
de
this
confinement que les pays ont
confinement
vécu
period that
et
different
qui a
countries
mis en
have gone
ligne
through.
et
This
en
report was published
exergue que
online,
près de
and it
90%
highlights
des
that nearly
95
90%
000
of the
musées qui
95,000
existent
museums
aujourd'hui
that
à travers
exist
le monde,
around the world,
c'est-à-dire
this
85 000
represents
institutions, ont
85,000
dû fermer
institutions had
plus ou
to
moins
close their
longtemps
doors for
leurs portes
more or less a
pendant
long time
cette crise. Et
during
certains
this
risquent de
crisis.
ne pas
And
ouvrir.
some museums may
L'impact
never
de ces
open their doors again.
fermetures
So the
est
impact
bien sûr
of these
économique,
closures is
social,
economic, of course, but also
éducatif
social,
et de cohésion
educational,
sociale,
and it's a
mais
problem
aussi
of social
sécuritaire,
cohesion. But it's also
dû,
a security
comme on a
issue
vu dans certains
because,
pays,
as we've
au
seen in some
vol d'œuvres
countries,
d'art
there have
dans
been
plusieurs
thefts of
musées.
artworks in several
Donc,
museums.
si l'impact
So if the
de la
impact
COVID-19
of
sur les
the COVID
institutions
pandemic on
publiques et
public
culturelles
institutions
a
and
été
cultural
sérieux,
institutions was
les
serious,
conséquences sur les
the
musées et les galeries
consequences on
privées
museums and
dont
private
l'activité
galleries
et la survie
whose activity
dépendent
and
du
survival
public, de la
depends on
clientèle
the audience,
et
on the
des
public,
activités
depends on their
commerciales ont
clientele
été,
and commercial
il faut le
activities.
dire,
Well, these
dramatiques.
consequences for them have been
N'oublions pas
dramatic.
que lorsque les
We mustn't
musées et les
forget that
galeries
when
d'art
museums and
sont
art
affectés,
galleries are
ce sont non
affected,
seulement
it
ces
is not only
institutions
these institutions that
qui
suffer,
souffrent, mais aussi
but
toutes les
it's
professions
all the
et le tissu
professions and
social
the social
qui y sont
fabric that
rattachés.
are attached to these
C'est
institutions.
pourquoi
That is
aujourd'hui,
why today,
Beyrouth
Beirut
a plus que jamais besoin
more than
d'un retour à la
ever
vie
needs
culturelle.
a return to cultural
Cette
life,
dernière a
because
toujours été
cultural
l'essence
life has
même
always been the very
de la ville.
essence of
Et ces
the city.
musées et
And
ces
its
nombreuses galeries
museums
d'art
and numerous
qui ont été
art
dévastées
galleries
par
which were
ces explosions
devastated by these
malheureuses
explosions, these
doivent
unfortunate
contribuer
explosions,
eux
have to
aussi à ce retour
contribute
rapide à la vie
to
culturelle
a
tant
quick
souhaité,
return to
non
this
seulement
cultural
par les
life that
Libanais,
is so much
mais
desired,
par
not
le monde
only by the
entier.
Lebanese, but by people all
Alors
over
le
the
débat
world.
d'aujourd'hui
So
que nous allons
today's
commencer est
debate
principalement axé
is mainly
sur les musées
based,
et les galeries d'art.
will
Ce que
mainly
l'on va
focus
essayer
on museums
au
and
cours
art
des
galleries.
prochaines minutes
And in the
à
following
faire,
minutes,
c'est
we're
d'abord de
going to
comprendre
try,
les
first of all,
dommages
to
et
better
autres
understand
matériels
the
économiques,
damage,
autres
the
dommages
material
matériels,
damage, the
économiques
economic
et
damage,
sociaux sur
the
les
social
musées et
damage
aussi sur les
suffered by
galeries d'art,
museums and art
bien
galleries,
entendu, y compris leurs collections.
as well as their collections,
Tous
of
les
course.
dommages qui ont été
All
causés
the
par ces explosions,
damage caused by the
parce que ces
explosions,
lieux étaient dans les zones
because these
affectées,
places were
et
situated
comprendre
in
aussi
the
ce que ça a provoqué
impact
comme
area. And
traumatisme
we need to understand
auprès de la
what
profession
traumas
et
this
aussi
has
auprès
created
des
in the
habitants.
profession and also
Et dans
in
la
the
deuxième
inhabitants
partie
of
de
these
notre
areas.
débat et de
And in
nos
the second part of our
discussions,
debate,
nous
of our
allons essayer de
discussions, we are going to
comprendre avec
try and
vous
understand with
pourraient
you
être les
what
interventions
could be
prioritaires qui
the
pourraient permettre aux
priorities,
musées et aux galeries
the
d'être
interventions that
réhabilités et
could be
redevenir
prioritized to help
fonctionnels.
rehabilitate museums and art
Donc,
galleries
c'est
to make them
vraiment
functional
un
again.
immense plaisir,
So it's
mesdames
a
et
great
messieurs,
pleasure for me
que je
today,
voudrais
ladies and
maintenant
gentlemen,
vous
to
présenter nos 7
present to
éminents
you our
panélistes qui
7
représentent
eminent
diverses
panelists who
institutions
represent
muséales
different
et galeries
museum
d'art de Beyrouth
institutions
et
and
que je
different
tiens
art
à
galleries in
remercier
Beirut.
très
And I'd like to
sincèrement, comme
thank them
déjà l'a
very
fait
sincerely,
Ernesto,
as Ernesto already has,
de leur présence.
and to thank them for their
Donc,
presence here
je
today.
voudrais commencer par
So I'd like to start
Monsieur Saleh
by
Barakat.
Introducing Mr.
Vous
Saleh
êtes
Barakat.
galeriste
You
spécialiste
are a
de la
gallery
peinture
owner
libanaise et arabe.
specialized in Lebanese
Vous avez
and Arabic
participé à de
painting.
nombreuses
You
tables
took
rondes et
part in
programmes
numerous
éducatifs
roundtables and
et à
educational programs and
l'organisation
to the
d'expositions
organization
clés
of key
pour l'art
exhibitions
libanais
for
et
Lebanese art
moyen-oriental.
and Middle
D'ailleurs,
Eastern
en
art.
2007,
In
vous avez
2007,
co-organisé
you
le premier pavillon libanais de
organized
la
the
Biennale de
first
Venise. Et
Lebanese
plus
pavilion
tard,
at the
2 années plus tard, en
Venice
2009,
Biennale.
vous
And
avez
then
été
2 years later, in
commissaire
2009,
de
you
la
were
Road to
the
Peace
commissioner of
au
the Road
Beirut
to
Art
Peace
Center.
at the Beirut Art
Vous
Center.
êtes membre du
You
conseil
are a member
consultatif de l'école
of the
d'architecture et de design de
Advisory Council of
l'université
the
libano-américaine
Architecture and
ainsi que
Design
membre
School of the
du conseil de
Libano-American
la Commission
University, as
nationale
well as a
libanaise
member of
pour
the
l'UNESCO.
National
Bienvenue,
Lebanese
Saleh.
Commission for UNESCO. Welcome, Mr. Saleh.
Et c'est vraiment un plaisir de vous
Hello.
avoir parmi nous.
It's a great pleasure to have you among us
Alors,
here today.
notre deuxième
Our
invité
second guest
est Djoumana Asseli de la
is
galerie
Madame
Marfa.
Djoumana Asseli of the Marfa Gallery.
Madame Djoumana
Madame Djoumana,
Asseli, vous travaillez avec des artistes
Madame
locaux
Djoumana Asseli, you
et
work with
régionaux pour
local
créer
artists
et
and regional
présenter des
artists in order to
projets
create and present
basés sur
projects that are
des idées qui
based
s'engagent
on ideas that are
dans la scène
involved
artistique
in the
contemporaine
artistic scene, the
diversifiée de Beyrouth.
contemporary diversified artistic
Votre
scene
galerie,
of Beirut.
on
Your
le sait,
gallery
aide les artistes locaux
helps
à
local
nouer des liens
artists
au niveau
to
international
create contacts at the
tout en
international
offrant
level,
une plateforme à Beyrouth
while at
à
the same
des
time
artistes internationaux.
giving a platform in Beirut to
Votre
international
galerie est
artists. Your
située
gallery is
dans
situated
2
in
garages
2
près de la douane
garages
dans le
near
quartier
to
de
the
Marfa,
custom
je crois.
house in the Marfa
Bienvenue,
neighborhood.
Madame Asseli.
Yes, that's true. Welcome.
Notre troisième invité
Our third guest
est
our third guest
et
today.
alors je retrouve mes papiers. André,
Notes.
Madame André Sfer-Semler.
Yes, says Madame André
Donc, Madame André Sfer-Semler, vous avez fondé la galerie éponyme en Allemagne
eponymous gallery
en
in
1985.
Germany in 1985.
20 ans plus
And
tard,
20 years
en
later,
2005,
in 2005,
vous ouvrez une
you
deuxième galerie
opened a second
à
gallery in
Beyrouth,
Beirut.
transformant une
You
ancienne usine
converted an old
en ce que vous
factory
avez appelé
into what you
White
called
Cube.
a white cube.
Le premier, d'ailleurs,
This
au
was the
Moyen-Orient.
first in the Middle
Vous êtes
East.
historienne de
You are
l'art
an art
et
historian.
vous avez également
You also
étudié
studied
l'histoire
art. You
et
also
vous avez
studied
obtenu
history,
votre doctorat
and received a
histoire de l'art
PhD in
en
art history in
1980. Votre
1980.
galerie,
Your gallery,
qui s'appelle Sphère Semler, représente
Gallery,
principalement des artistes
represents
conceptuels et
mainly
minimalistes.
conceptual and minimalist
Et
artists.
elle est principalement concentrée depuis
Since
2003
2003,
sur l'art
it's
contemporain
specifically
du monde
focused on
arabe.
contemporary
Et vous
art of
contribuez
the
ainsi
Arab
au
world, and
lancement
thus
et
you
au
contribute
développement
to
de
the
la
launching and
carrière
development of
de
the
nombreux
career
artistes
of
de la
numerous
région.
artists in the region.
Bienvenue à
Welcome
vous et
to
merci d'avoir
you, and
accepté de
thank you
vous
for having
joindre
accepted
à nous.
our invitation to join us today.
Ensuite,
Next,
je voudrais
we
présenter
have
notre autre invitée, Suzy
our next
Hakimian,
guest,
qui
which
est la
is
présidente du
Suzy
comité
Hakimian,
national de
who
l'ICOM
is
au
the
Liban.
president of the International
Madame
Council
Suzy
of
Hakimian,
Museums
vous
in
êtes
Lebanon.
présidente du comité national de
You
l'ICOM
are
Liban
the president
et vous êtes
of the
ancienne
Lebanese
conservatrice
ICOM,
du
and
musée
you are
national de
the
Beyrouth. Et
ex-curator of the
actuellement, vous
National
êtes
Museum of
conservatrice
Beirut.
du musée des
And now
minéraux.
you are the curator of the
Ce
Mineral
musée,
Museum.
en
This
fait, qui a
museum,
ouvert
which
en
opened its
octobre
doors in October
2013, abrite
2013,
la deuxième
houses
collection
the
privée la
second
plus importante
largest
de
private
minéraux
collection
au
of
monde.
minerals in the world.
Bienvenue, Madame Hakimian.
Welcome, Madame Hakimian.
Maintenant, je voudrais
Now I would
présenter
like to
Madame Anne-Marie
introduce
Affesh,
Madame Anne-Marie Affesh,
qui est la directrice
who
générale
is
du
the
Conseil
General
général des
Director
musées
of
du
the
Liban.
General Council of Museums of Lebanon.
Madame Anne-Marie
Madame
Affesh, vous êtes
Anne-Marie,
directrice générale du
you are
Conseil des
the
musées
Director
du
General of
Liban,
the General Council
qui
of
relève
Museums
du
in
ministère de la
Lebanon,
Culture.
which
Et
is under the authority of the
vous
Ministry of
avez été
Culture.
anciennement directrice du
You
musée
were
national
previously the
des
director
Beyrouth
of the National
et
Museum of
qui
Beirut,
conserve
which houses
une collection archéologique du Liban,
the Lebanese
même si elle
archaeological
a été
collection,
relativement
even
épargnée
though this museum was
par l'explosion.
left rather
Bienvenue à
unscathed
vous,
by the explosion.
Madame
Welcome
Anne-Marie
to you,
Affesh.
Madame Anne-Marie Affesh.
Je voudrais également présenter
I'd also like
Madame Zeina Arida,
to introduce Ms.
qui est la
Zeina Arida,
directrice du musée Sursock
who is director of the Sursock
de
Museum
Beyrouth.
in Beirut.
Donc, Madame Zeina Arida, vous êtes directrice
Zeina
du
Arida,
musée Sursock
you are
depuis sa
the
réouverture
director
en 2015.
and have been since
Ce
it
musée qui a
reopened in
été fortement
2015. The
endommagé,
Sursock
dont on a
Museum,
vu de
which was
nombreuses
badly
images
damaged and of which
dans
we've
les
seen many
médias,
pictures in the media,
est le seul qui est dédié à
is
l'art
the only
moderne et
one
contemporain
dedicated to
du
modern
Liban.
and
C'était vraiment un
contemporary art
plaisir de
in
vous
Lebanon.
avoir
And
parmi nous
it's a great
aujourd'hui,
pleasure to
Madame
have you
Arida.
with us today, Ms. Arida.
Enfin,
Finally,
je voudrais vous présenter
I should
Madame
like to
Naila
introduce
Ketane
Ms.
de la
Naila
galerie
Ketane
Tanit.
from the Tanit Gallery.
Madame Naila Ketane,
Ms. Naila Ketane,
depuis plus de 40 ans,
for
la
more than
galerie
40
Tanit
years
joue
now,
un
the
rôle
Gallery Tanit
important
has been
dans la
playing an
présentation
important
des
role
artistes
in presenting
américains
American
au
artists
public allemand et au-delà.
to Germany
La
and
galerie Tanit
audience beyond
a été
Germany.
fondée par vous
The Tanit Gallery
et
was founded by
Stefan König
yourself and
à
Stefan
Munich
König
en
in Munich
1972.
in 1972.
Après 2002, le
After
programme de la galerie
2002,
s'est
the
progressivement tourné vers
gallery's
une
program
génération
progressively
d'artistes beaucoup
moved
plus jeunes
toward a much
et a
younger
présenté des
generation of
artistes
artists
internationaux.
introduced the
Comme
world to
on va
international
citer par
artists.
exemple
We might
Jérémy Blake
mention Jeremy Blake
ou Michael Lynn
or
au
Michael
public
Lynn
local. Donc la
to
galerie
a
est
local
basée
audience.
à la fois à
And
Beyrouth
so this
et à
gallery
Munich.
that you run
Bienvenue à
is
vous.
based in both Beirut and Munich.
Alors, je voudrais
Welcome.
passer un petit peu aux premières
Let
questions.
me now move on
Et
to the first question.
je vais cette fois-ci un peu
And this
commencer
time around, I should like to begin
avant et je poserai une question à chacun de nos panélistes.
by
Je
asking
commencerai
a
d'abord par
question
nos
to
invités qui
each
sont
of
des
our
professionnels des
panelists.
musées.
And I think I'll start with those of our
Vous
guests who
avez
are
environ
museum
4 minutes pour
professionals.
répondre
And
à
you'll
ces
have about
questions.
4
Et
minutes
dans
to
un
answer
deuxième
these
temps,
questions.
je
And
poserai
then after
deux autres
that,
questions
I'll
ou
ask
une
two
question
other,
selon le temps plus
or perhaps
général à
just one
chacun de nos
question,
intervenants.
depending on how
Et
much
pour
time we
finir,
have, of a
nous
more
prendrons
general
quelques
nature
questions si nous
to each
avons du temps
participant. And then after
posées par
that,
les
if we have time,
spectateurs sur le
we'll
chat.
let
Donc, je vais
the
commencer un petit peu
audience have
par
a chat,
nos invités
ask
qui sont des
questions as well.
professionnels
So let me
des
begin with
musées.
those of our
Et je
guests who
voudrais
are
commencer
museum
par
professionals. And I'll start
Madame
with
Suzy Hakimian. Et
Ms. Suzy
permettez-moi
Hakimian.
de vous appeler Suzy.
Please
Pour
allow
que
me
ce
to
soit
call you
peut-être un peu plus
Suzy.
simple, si vous
That would be
permettez.
a bit
Alors, Suzy,
simpler if you'd allow me.
en
Suzy,
tant que présidente du comité national de l'ICOM au
Committee
Liban,
of ICOM in Lebanon.
vous connaissez bien la
You're
réalité du
very
secteur
familiar
muséal,
with
tant
the
public que
reality of the
privé,
museum sector, both in the public and in
qui
the
était
private
jusqu'à l'explosion du
sectors.
4 août un secteur très dynamique.
And it had been a very
Quel
dynamic
rôle
sector up
jouaient
until the explosion of
les
August
musées
4th.
qui ont été endommagés,
What
certains plus que
roles
d'autres,
did some of those
dans la vie
museums
culturelle
play,
libanaise?
all of which were damaged, some more than others, in Lebanese cultural life? Good evening to everyone. Thank you for asking me to be on this panel, which will perhaps allow me to add some information. And I'd also like to say how important it is for us to feel around us for the last month, the support and the affection which are being expressed by institutions to which we belong, what we call our mother institutions, if you will, our parents' institutions. Now, Director, you put forth a very important point, which is this visceral link between society and museums. Museums belong to society, and they owe everything to society. And they had been working very well for the last couple of years in a very dynamic society, very oriented toward cultural activity. When our society was doing well, Lebanese museums were doing well as well, and could therefore take part in different activities, which allowed members of the public to come and participate in these activities structured around museums. When you come to a museum, you're looking for something important, which in a way vouches for cultural continuity, and that's what our collections used to do and hope will do again. But unfortunately, as you very clearly explained, life became much more difficult for the museums at the beginning of the economic crisis in Lebanon. We started having many fewer visitors. Many visitors in Lebanon get many visitors from schools, and we have seasons which are particularly important for our museums that follow the school calendar. And then when COVID happened, we had a second shock, and we found ourselves plunged into an incredible situation where we were obliged to close our doors and not have any visitors. We've been in total lockdown since March 13th, and we stayed closed until the 13th or the 15th of June. And some museums opened and others were not able to do so even at that time, because they were on university campuses, which remained locked down because it is forbidden even for students to go to those campuses. So you can imagine how these museums were cut off from the very society they belong to. During the following months, we tried to take our activity in hand, but then unfortunately on August 4th, a cataclysm engulfed all of Beirut, including 8 museums in the capital. And even almost 12 kilometers away, we have a museum whose windows and structures were affected by the explosion. So these museums lost their doors, their windows, their structures. And today, we see that these museums need to be rebuilt above all, so as to be able to protect their collections. And I can say that there's been a miracle already, to the extent that we have not lost 90% of our collections. The Sursac Museum has suffered greatly, was greatly damaged by the explosion. And we find ourselves in a particularly serious situation today. This reconstruction will happen. I can reassure everyone that that is true. A mission just finished yesterday. Came here to Beirut to see built heritage and monuments. I'm sorry, and I'm optimist. The word pessimist slipped out, and I'm optimistic that we will be able to rebuild our museums. But we'll have to do the same for our society.
Merci beaucoup, Suzy, d'avoir été sur cette note positive. On en a besoin. Et on est très heureux que ce type de message vienne de vous, et notamment vraiment dire que le rôle des musées dans la société est ce pont culturel, ce pont qui peut se faire qui permet aux sociétés de continuer à exister et à s'exprimer et surtout à se faire connaître est extrêmement important. Dans la même lignée des questions, je voudrais demander à Anne-Marie, vous qui dirigez le Conseil général qui est de la direction générale du Conseil des musées.
Conseil national des musées.
Justement, ces 8 musées dont Suzy parlait, qui ont été touchés par l'explosion aujourd'hui, qui souffrent de cette question de cette pression et des conséquences de la pandémie. Quelles autres difficultés supplémentaires vous pensez que cette explosion a engendré, chère Anne-Marie?
Explosion has unleashed? Good evening. Thank you all for this invitation. Thank you, Excellencies. Good evening to everyone. Well, these 8 museums were affected, as Suzy said, to a different extent, and experienced the terrible explosion of August 4, 2020 somewhat differently. I would ask today what additional problems exist. I think, in fact, these problems already existed because of COVID and because of the economic and financial crisis, which meant that our museums were receiving less visitors. The danger we have today is elsewhere, I think, because our museums will be rebuilt, and we have great hope with all the assistance that's been mobilized everywhere, that the collections will be restored, that the buildings will be rebuilt. But what I fear, and here perhaps I'm more pessimistic than Suzy, is a problem of vulnerability, a problem of education, a problem of the role of museums themselves. As we know, museums have a great role to play in terms of social cohesion, have a great role to play in education, with students being given a feeling of citizenship, of national belonging. And here is the difficulty that I see. The social difficulties that we will have that mean perhaps museums will not be as important as they were because priorities will be placed elsewhere, perhaps. And that, I think, is the danger we need to avoid. We have to do everything we can to avoid this cultural sector from dying or falling into lethargy. And this is where we see UNESCO and all the other institutions have mobilized to ensure that museums' role goes on being played and that museums can do what they must do within society in a dynamic way. And we will do everything we can to see that that happens.
Oui, tout à fait. Merci beaucoup pour avoir souligné cette importante question du risque de vulnérabilité et de déconsidération du rôle des musées. C'est peut-être là où le plaidoyer qu'il nous faudra tous faire ensemble est nécessaire et important et on va le continuer avec effectivement le rôle et l'appui de la communauté internationale aussi. Et cette fois-ci, justement, dans les premières interventions, on a beaucoup regretté ce qui s'est passé avec le musée sur Sorgue. Et je voudrais demander à Zena, vous qui êtes la directrice du musée sur Sorgue, on a suivi votre plaidoyer dans de nombreux médias, y compris ici en France où l'UNESCO se trouve, et pour que ce musée soit réhabilité. Et vous êtes déterminés à le réhabiliter. On vous remercie pour ce message que vous avez passé aussi sur la signification importante des collections qu'il y avait. Comment vous et vos équipes, Zena, avez-vous vécu cette explosion? Qu'est-ce qui vous donne cette force-là? Que pouvez-vous nous dire? Merci beaucoup.
Thank you very much. Well, in fact, it's true. You said that I began working at the Sursac Museum when it reopened, but in fact, my team and myself participated in the reorganization of the museum as it exists today. We worked about 2 years upstream of the opening to prepare everything. We thought about the way the collections could be presented, exhibitions could happen, and also the role that the museum could play. And the cultural and artistic scene, which had been living without the museum for almost 10 years because the museum had been closed for, yes, let's say 10 years. And in fact, what was very difficult with the explosion on August 4th was to see at the end of the day work that had been done over 6 or 7 years disappear in just a few seconds. And moreover, I have to say I was at the museum with 4 members of my team, and symbolically also the fact that we were physically there at that time and we heard the sound that we heard after the explosion. All the panes of glass, all the windows, stained glass as well, everything broke. There's been a lot of damage to the collection. 50 artworks have been damaged. I think that in spite of the shock, at 8 o'clock the following morning, we were all at the museum. We didn't really have the choice of doing anything other than spring into action right away. We were very responsible to the artworks which were there with no more ceiling protecting them. Anyone could get in. And that's how we got started again. And the expressions of international solidarity and of local solidarity were very important in this strength. I don't think strength is the right word. I'm not strong today, but I'm in action because I don't have any choice. The museum, I think, museums in general have no choice but to rebuild, as Anne-Marie said just now. I'm not too concerned, in spite of the fact that it's so frustrating to have to start over basically from scratch again. We had a campaign where we updated all of the museum's collections a year before we reopened, and we're going to have to start over again. We're literally going to have to dust off all of the collection again. The reserves weren't affected, but there's now a film of dust on everything that was inside the museum. And so we really have to clean up all of the artworks, the archives, the books, everything. And that's a lot of money that's going to have to be spent as well. The reconstruction of the museum will require money we would have liked to spend somewhere else, not just in the museum, but in other sectors as well, because as Suzy, Anne-Marie, and others have said, the cultural sector was already having a very difficult time meeting its own needs. Art galleries can barely make it to the end of the month. And all the money we're now going to have to spend and that organizations are going to raise for rebuilding buildings that were destroyed in a crisis, an explosion that has still not been explained to us. It's horrible and it's almost impossible to accept.
Merci, j'ai beaucoup apprécié.
Thank you very much. I
voudrais vraiment
greatly
souligner ce que
appreciate
vous
it,
avez
and I
dit,
want to
c'est-à-dire ce
emphasize one thing that
côté
you said.
aussi révoltant de la situation, et en même temps, vous avez dit le lendemain à 8 heures, nous étions debout avec les équipes et nous étions sur le terrain parce que c'est notre responsabilité de préserver ces collections. Et en fait, c'est ce message que l'on doit continuer à montrer parce que c'est une histoire belle pour que toute la communauté internationale, tous ceux qui nous suivent, nous écoutent, se rendent compte à quel point sur place, l'engagement est fort et la détermination est si encourageante pour comprendre que l'ensemble des professionnels est déterminé et au musée Sursock, ce musée n'est pas prêt de mourir, comme va dire, de fermer ses portes. Il réouvrira. Donc c'est un beau message et merci à vous et à vos équipes de faire ce travail-là et nous sommes avec vous et nous allons travailler ensemble. Je voudrais maintenant me retourner vers vous, Naila. Vous avez été aussi personnellement touché touché
also
par
personally
ces
affected
explosions,
by these
parce que
explosions,
si
because
je comprends bien,
if I
votre
understand
galerie a
correctly,
été
your gallery
beaucoup détruite.
was
Et
seriously
voilà.
destroyed.
Pouvez-vous nous parler
Can you tell us
du travail
Can you
que
tell us
vous
about the work that
meniez
you've had been
avant
doing
l'explosion?
before the explosion? Before the explosion, we had an exhibition by an artist whose works was buried under the iron and steel and glass that was destroyed, under all that the gallery was made out of. And personally, since I was only slightly wounded, I accompanied a seriously wounded person to several hospitals to save that person's life. And I also had a team of friends, of old co-workers of mine who volunteered to evacuate the works of art from the ground, but also from our reserves that were underground, in the basement and on the ground floor of the gallery. There are 62 works that were partially or completely destroyed, unfortunately. And having two co-workers, one of them who had a mental panic attack, who's incapable of working anymore, who's was in hospital, another one who's very wounded. Well, this means that my team is been radically reduced right now. We've tried to set up a support concept in another gallery where they did two 80 there was 80 works that are sold within and outside Lebanon too, to help an NGO called Basma. And I thought that was the only thing that we could do in the desolate situation that we were in at that moment. Because if one is to do something to redo the same thing is beautiful, but working with artists to do new work is quite difficult right now, because we all need to rebuild ourselves. And we need to set our priorities today, apart from the incredible costs of rebuilding the glass, the air conditioning, the lighting, the steel structures. And for the time being, we don't have any support. We have right to a small credit of 50 million from the central bank if we want it, and they'll give us half of it in cash and the other half in checks. But you know that you can't really go doesn't take you very far, this sum of money, with the financial crisis that we're in right now. So for example, I asked how much the lighting costs, and that's alone is 47,000 euros, which we'd have to find. So before we do that, I'm trying to help the artists that were impacted, and also to help certain institutions who need our active help, all the while waiting to see what direction artists and ourselves will take.
Vraiment, merci beaucoup
pour
ce que vous avez dit, et surtout cette action, malgré le traumatisme que vous et vos équipes avez personnellement vécu, de trouver la force de monter cette action en soutien des ONG pour aider à toutes les autres questions urgentes dont les habitants ont besoin. Et je crois qu'on voit encore aussi qu'au-delà de l'aspect artistique et culturel, le rôle que les galeries et les artistes mènent aussi, c'est vraiment de participer à la vie de la société. Et dans cette situation où tout le monde a besoin de se retrousser les manches et travailler ensemble, merci beaucoup de partager avec nous ce moment d'humanité, de solidarité. Alors, je voudrais maintenant me tourner vers Saleh.
Mr. Saleh.
votre travail est
Your
essentiellement
work
centré
is
sur la promotion des peintres
essentially
libanais,
focused on promoting
comme je l'ai
Lebanese
dit,
painters, as I mentioned
qui
before.
aussi ont souffert de ces
And these
explosions.
painters also suffered
Nous
as a
savons
consequence of these explosions. And
que
we know
vous
that
avez été
you
aussi
were
personnellement
also
touché.
personally impacted by
Donc
these
c'est bien sûr
explosions.
avec beaucoup de
So it
tristesse
is
que
with
nous
deep sorrow
souhaitons vraiment
that
rendre
we would
hommage
like
à votre
to
éminent
pay
collègue
homage to your eminent
qui a perdu
colleague
la
who
vie.
lost
Il
his
est important
life.
aussi
It
dans
is
des
also
moments comme ceux-ci
important
où nous
in
pouvons nous
such difficult
retrouver
moments
pour
where we can
parler
gather together
vraiment
to talk,
de
talk.
rendre,
It's
de
very
témoigner aussi
important to bear
de cette
witness
tragédie dans
to this
toute
tragedy,
son ampleur ici même. Donc,
to the whole width and breadth of
pourriez-vous
this
nous
tragedy.
parler
So
vraiment
could you
aussi des
really tell
difficultés
us about the
que
difficulties
rencontrent maintenant des
that
institutions comme la
institutions such as
vôtre
yours are
aujourd'hui
going through
depuis
right
qu'il y a
now
eu cette explosion salée?
since this explosion took place? Well, thank you very much for this invitation and for allowing me to share with you our major challenges. Since the October Revolution and COVID and ending with the explosions on the 4th of August, there were many challenges that came one after the other. And so the first challenge was that we had a team of employees, of employees who we have to keep, we have to pay their wages in an economic situation that has seen the economy collapse gradually. So this was an important issue for us, this whole team that worked with us for many years in an economic situation where people were being laid off or were being paid half their wages. So it was important for us to be able to support them in this period during which the market's doing really badly, but one has to have solidarity with one's workers. So we're a team. We have just lost one of our colleagues, a colleague who worked with us for 20 years, and this was something that was really extremely sad. It's very difficult to get over this. We will not forget it. But as all my colleagues have said, we need to continue to work for those who are living, for all these employees, all these teams, all the artists with whom we work, who have families to feed, who have all their own responsibilities, and we must continue to help them. And on the other hand, one also has to realize that Lebanon, after this difficult year, after the October Revolution, for security reasons, many people would not come here from abroad. There was a case of capital control where we no longer had access to our own money. And so we had to try and find structures to find solutions for all our foreign clients, for all our international representatives, because if we want to participate to international art shows, we have to transfer money, which of course in this situation was impossible for us. So we had to see how we could adapt locally to all this situation of the Lebanese pound, these Lebanese dollars that are in Lebanese banks that we no longer have access to. Well, we had to deal with this whole situation, and an economy that was more and more cash-based, whereas for 30 years, most of us and most of the Lebanese economy, we would take cash out, but we were leaving cash, rather. We were leaving cash behind us, whereas now we're going back to cash. And after August 4th, we need to rebuild, renovate our galleries, all our all our contracts, all the things we need to buy. We have to pay for them with cash, but we don't have cash. So we have to find means today to find hard currency, to find cash. And on the international scene, of course, cash is something that's seen as being maybe something a bit dirty, but we have to adapt to that, to adapt the internal situation to the external situation. And unfortunately, artists buy all their materials in dollars. So there's a lot of challenges to be able to continue to survive and to adapt to a situation which a year ago would have appeared completely impossible to us. But that's how it is. We have to rebuild, we have to continue, we have to adapt. Personally, I have started work on the gallery. We will be ready in about a week to start again. I would like to wish all the best of courage to all my colleagues who've suffered much worse damage than I have personally. And as Naila said, we start again, but with a lot of anger inside us, and we don't know. We're afraid. Personally, I'm afraid for this platform whose name is Beirut, for this multi-ethnic, multi-religious platform, which is really in danger today. And so in the future, we'll have to talk about the role of UNESCO in order to keep this Beirut platform, this Levantine identity, which is in danger today, because this is a true wealth for humanity that has to be supported in these difficult moments.
Merci, Saleh. Je vais reprendre là où vous avez terminé, c'est-à-dire que, effectivement, cette plateforme multiculturelle que vous appelez Beyrouth, que certains d'entre nous connaissent ou certains d'entre nous ont passé des séjours inoubliables. Oui, cette plateforme doit continuer à exister. En fait, vous le démontrez déjà. Vous serez de nouveau opérationnel dans une semaine. C'est formidable avec tous les efforts que vous essayez de faire. C'est vraiment à saluer. Merci vraiment pour ça et bravo. Et puis oui, quel rôle l'UNESCO pourrait jouer. Et on va entamer cette deuxième partie de notre discussion effectivement là-dessus et comment vous voyez les choses parce que nous voulons vous écouter. Justement, nous voulons avoir vos idées sur ces questions. Mais avant ça, je voudrais me tourner vers Joumana. Parce que vous qui avez opté pour travailler avec les jeunes artistes libanais, est-ce que vous pourriez nous dire comment a évolué l'expression de ces jeunes artistes et aujourd'hui comment l'impact de ces explosions assure leurs expressions artistiques ou leur travail. C'est peut-être un peu tôt de poser cette question, mais je pense que vous avez certainement déjà une idée parce que vous continuez, vous êtes quelqu'un de très dynamique, on le sait, donc vous avez beaucoup de choses à partager avec nous de ce côté.
Yes, good evening, Your Excellency. Good evening, Lazar. Thank you for this invitation. Yes, we're continuing, but we're very tired. We're truly tired. I opened my gallery more recently than all my colleagues. So just 5 years ago, nearly exactly 5 years ago, in October 2015, just when the Sursault Museum was reopening. The gallery is in the port near the customs house. We have 2 garages there. And we had 4 fantastic years with exhibitions and fairs. And then suddenly, well, not suddenly exactly, we saw that things were taking a turn for the worst with the October 17th. And even before that, it's as if someone was slowly dimming the lights. And then suddenly we were in complete darkness and then the explosion. It's very difficult. It's difficult for us, of course, for all the reasons that have already been mentioned financially. It's difficult for the artists. It's difficult for them to produce their works. It's difficult to set up exhibitions. It's difficult to travel. Traveling, whether it be from a financial point of view, meaning how to pay for traveling. And now with the context of COVID, all these fairs that have been cancelled, we're more and more in a sort of stranglehold. With this explosion, many artists are still under shock. Everyone, of course, reacts in their own manner, and some people can't work after going through such a shock. Others, on the contrary, work actually really helps them. Some of them have already left Lebanon and have gone abroad to continue working, and that helps them. But it really depends on the artist. It's a case-by-case scenario. And of course, we'd like to reopen like everyone does, but like I said, we're very tired, and I don't know when I'll start working on reopening. I wanted to start the day when the fire happened, but now I put the brakes on because we don't know what's going to happen in this port. Everything has to be redone. We had a group exhibition that day, or rather a group hanging. And most of these artists, we had 20 artists, a lot of them had damaged works. Luckily, my stock of works was not in that space. It's not easy to find alternatives with these artists, whether it be abroad or working with virtual galleries or to set up collaborations. We'll sort it out, but it is very tiring, very, very tiring.
Oui, je vous comprends et effectivement, à un certain moment, c'est vrai que c'est épuisant. Et vous l'avez bien donné en donnant cette image de cette lumière qui s'éteint progressivement et puis tout d'un coup, il y a un noir, on ne sait pas si elle va se rallumer. Et en même temps, vous avez envie de la rallumer. C'est ça qui est formidable. Et en même temps, vous faites en même temps aussi un appel.
At the same time, you are appealing for help, and that's why it was important to hear you out and to understand the psychological state that these explosions led to. How you have been impacted by this and how other artists and gallery owners have been impacted psychologically, to understand that it really is something very serious that we need to focus on, because creativity is so important, and it's important for a return to cultural life in Beirut. Thank you very much. Now I'd like to finish this first part of our debate with Madame André.
C'est vrai, vous travaillez beaucoup sur la promotion de l'art contemporain libanais à l'étranger. Comment voyez-vous les conséquences dues à la fois à la crise économique dont certains ont parlé tout à l'heure, et aussi à l'explosion sur la promotion de ces artistes libanais aujourd'hui à l'international.
The promotion of Lebanese artists internationally. Good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for having invited me here today.
La situation
The situation in Lebanon is terrible.
Elle est brutale.
It is a brutal
Nous avons
situation.
recommencé à restaurer notre espace.
We started to restore our space. It's a lot of work to restore our space, because we're talking about 1,400 square meters and everything's been destroyed. Workers started. My team is on the ground every morning from the day after the explosion. They've been working there. But we were lucky because we didn't have any works that were damaged, and we had no loss of life either. As for our artists in Lebanon, what I'm most scared of in the present situation is the exodus. We'll find money, we'll be able to rebuild the walls of our building. It's true that we don't have any capital in the country right now, but I'm lucky to have two galleries. I have one in Hamburg and one in Beirut. I have two bank accounts in Hamburg and in Beirut, and my Hamburg account is helping my Beirut gallery. I'm restoring Beirut thanks to Hamburg, but the problem is that Hamburg can't survive without Beirut, because in the work that we've done in the last 20 years, Beirut became our heart, our spirit, our very blood. And we've been working in our Hamburg gallery, like working in an NGO to find the funds there for everyone. And we're trying to give courage back to everyone who is working in Lebanon. We want to start again, to have exhibitions, to have shows, but I'm asking myself how. I see that there's really a need in the cultural sphere today. I think our cultural spaces are very important in order to create a space for communication, an intellectual space for exchange that goes beyond religions and confessions. In a country where there is no solid state, where there's no security, our role is really important, and that is why I launched this gallery in 2004. We opened in 2005, but I opened it
ouverture religieuse ou
I
politique
opened it
dans un lieu
to
qui
be
n'appartient à
apolitical
personne.
and unreligious,
Et
something that
je
doesn't
l'ai
really belong
ouverte
to
en fait
any one
comme une plaque
person.
tournante.
And I
Les
wanted it to
personnes
be a
pouvaient
sort of
échanger,
platform for
se
people to
voir, se
exchange
rencontrer.
ideas, to be able
Et
to
j'ai
meet
ouvert
each
un espace
other.
aussi important
I
pour donner la
opened
chance
such
à
an
mes
important
artistes
space in order to
en
give a chance
produisant
to
beaucoup
my
d'œuvres
artists.
chaque exposition.
They produce a lot
En
of
leur
work for
donnant
each
beaucoup de
exhibition.
visibilité
I
internationale
try to
parce
give
que
them as
beaucoup
much
de
visibility
commissaires venaient
internationally
justement
because
pour voir le
many
travail.
commissioners came to
Et
see the works.
dans la tristesse de tout ce qui se passe,
And
le plus brutal, c'est
the
l'exode.
worst thing in this whole situation
Quand
is
je vois combien de
exodus.
jeunes
When I see
personnes
how many young
quotidiennement
people
m'annoncent qu'ils sont en train de
every day
partir,
tell me that they're
tous
getting
ceux
ready to
qui
leave.
peuvent se le permettre, tous ceux qui ont une
Anyone who has the
formation,
means to do it, anyone
qui ont fait
who
des études,
has
qui connaissent
training,
les
who
langues,
studied, who
partent.
knows
Et c'est
languages,
ça ce qui est le plus
all of
brutal.
these people are
Ce ne
leaving,
sont
and
pas
that's
les
the most
pierres,
serious
ce
thing.
n'est pas la
It's
lumière.
not
Tout ça,
the
on y arrivera.
lighting, the
Mais le
stones,
départ des
the
personnes
spaces. We can manage with that,
est
but
effrayant. Ils ne
losing
reviendront.
people, that is scary because they will not
Quant
come
à mes
back.
artistes,
Well, as
nous
to
sommes
my
arrivés à leur
artists,
donner
we
une
managed
sécurité sur
to
deux
give
pieds.
them some security,
C'est un couteau à double tranchant. D'un
but it's
côté,
a sort of a double-edged
nous sommes dans
sword.
une
Because on the
situation
one
terrifiante
hand, we're in a terrifying
au
situation
pays,
in
mais
Lebanon.
ceci attire l'attention de
But this
beaucoup de
draws
commissaires
lots
internationaux,
of
de musées
international attention,
internationaux.
lots of
Et
international
nous sommes
museums' attention
en
on
train
us. So
de beaucoup travailler aussi
we're working a
à
lot
finaliser
in trying to put the
les placements
finishing
d'œuvres importants dans des musées importants
finishing
pendant que
touches
tout ça a
on
lieu.
placing
Donc, le
important works in
témoignage
important
est en route.
museums.
Nous
So
sommes en train de
things are moving.
donner des œuvres,
We are
pas de donner, de
giving,
les vendre
well, rather not
naturellement,
giving, but selling
à
works, of
plusieurs
course,
musées.
to several
Hier,
museums.
aujourd'hui, demain, on a des
Yesterday,
demandes sans
today,
arrêt.
tomorrow, we have a lot
Donc,
of
je ne
demand.
m'inquiète pas pour mes
So I'm not
artistes, je m'inquiète pour
worried
notre
for the
pays.
artists, I'm worried
Nous
for our country.
sécurisons l'avenir de nos artistes, comme je
We
l'ai
are
dit, depuis
guaranteeing or
l'étranger
trying
et
to
à
guarantee
l'étranger
the
dans le
security
monde
of our
entier.
artists from abroad
Mais
and abroad in the
j'ai
whole
bien
world,
peur
but
que nous
I'm
ayons
quite
perdu notre pays.
scared that we may have
Il est
lost
en
our
partance.
country.
Et comment est-ce que nous allons continuer?
And how
Je
we
ne le sais pas.
continue, well, that is
Parce
something
que
I
pour
really
qui
don't
nous
know.
continuons?
Because who are
Qui
we
va
going to
voir
continue
ces
for?
œuvres
Who is going
si
to
tout
come
le
and
monde
see
s'en
these
va?
works
Est-ce
if
que nous
everyone
sommes
leaves?
le Gaza de demain?
Are
Ou
we
le
the
Gaza
Gaza Strip
d'aujourd'hui?
of tomorrow or
Est-ce
the
que nous
Gaza
sommes
Strip of
devenus la
today? Have we
Palestine?
become
Nous sommes pris en
Palestine?
otage
We've been taken
et
hostage.
l'aide que l'UNESCO peut nous
And
apporter,
the
vous qui
help that
me posez la
UNESCO
question,
can bring us, since
c'est
you're asking us
de
these questions,
protéger la
is to
population
protect
libanaise, si
the
vous le
Lebanese
pouvez,
people, if you can do that.
parce que la
Because
population
the
libanaise est
Lebanese
prise en
people
otage.
has been taken
Voilà.
hostage. That's what I have to say.
Merci beaucoup, cher André, parce
Thank you
que
very much, André.
c'est vrai, vous avez dit quelque chose d'extrêmement important, de la dualité dans le travail entre
dual nature
Hambourg et Beyrouth.
of the work you do between
Et
Hamburg and
vous avez
Beirut.
aussi dit que
And
vous étiez
you've
vraiment
also
très
said
préoccupé
that
par
you
le
were very
risque
deeply
de
concerned
l'exode de
by the
nombreux
risk
artistes qui auront
that
peut-être...
many artists would leave the
donc,
country.
une des choses, c'est que oui, il faut continuer à
And so one thing
promouvoir
to
les
say is
artistes
yes, we must
libanais
go on
encore
promoting
plus
Lebanese
aujourd'hui que
artists
hier.
even more today
Et
than
c'est aussi
yesterday.
un message
And
que l'on peut
this
passer
is a
pour que
message
l'on
that
s'intéresse
we can
beaucoup plus,
pass
encore
along
un peu plus à ce travail
so that
là
people
que les
take a
artistes
greater
libanais
interest in the
ont
work
mené et
that
continuent de
Lebanese
mener.
artists
Je crois
have
que c'est
done and
vraiment
are still doing.
un message
I think that this
important.
is a
Vous
very
avez
important
parlé
message.
de comment
You
l'UNESCO
also
peut
talked about
accompagner,
how
comment l'UNESCO
UNESCO
peut aider. Et
could help
Ernesto,
and support
tout à l'heure, effectivement, a dit que c'était extrêmement
these
très
efforts.
important de vous
Ernesto said
écouter
earlier that it was very
là-dessus.
important to
Donc, je voudrais
listen to
vraiment,
you.
merci beaucoup pour tous vos
I would like,
éclairages.
therefore, to
Je voudrais
thank
venir
you for
maintenant
all
sur,
the light you
sur cette
have shed on
deuxième
these different
partie pour les 30
subjects.
dernières minutes
And
qui
I'd
nous
like
restent,
for the 30 minutes remaining to
vraiment
us
de
to
vous
come back
écouter. Vous avez vraiment mis en
to the
évidence les
second part. You
conséquences
have really brought out, I think, the
ainsi que l'impact
consequences
matériel,
and the impact,
économique,
both
psychologique
material,
de ces
psychological and
explosions
economic,
sur
of
le
these
regard que vous portez à
explosions.
votre travail, mais
And the way
aussi
this makes you look at
votre
the
détermination quelque
places
part
where
à
you
ne pas
work, but
abandonner.
also
C'est le
your
message que vous nous avez
determination
passé.
not to give
Vous
up.
n'abandonnez pas.
And that
Vous êtes
was, I think, the
résilient et
message
c'est
you
une
had.
leçon
You're not giving up,
formidable
you're
que vous venez
resilient, and I think that this is an
de nous
incredible
passer.
lesson
C'est un message
that
important
you
qu'il
are
faut, on
teaching
va
us.
relayer. Message pour la
And we
ville,
need to pass that
message pour la
message along,
population,
a
pour
message
le
for
peuple
the city,
libanais.
for the population of the city, for the
Donc,
whole Lebanese
ce que je
people.
voudrais que vous fassiez,
And what I would
peut-être si
like
vous le souhaitez, au
now,
cours de cette
if
deuxième
you
partie de la
wish,
table ronde,
in the
c'est
second part of our
de répondre à
would be
une question,
to
probablement
answer
peut-être en deux temps. Donc,
another
d'abord,
question, which might be
je
divided in
voudrais
two
poser
parts. First of all,
cette question un peu
I'd
pour les
like to
professionnels des
ask a
musées.
question of
Et,
museum professionals.
et je voulais savoir, en fait, maintenant,
And I'd
donc,
like
qu'on vous a
to
écouté,
know now, having listened to you,
comment voyez-vous
how do
aujourd'hui
you see
le rôle des musées pour
today
favoriser
the role of
le
museums
retour à cette
in
vie culturelle
encouraging
que l'on savait
a
très riche à Beyrouth?
return to the very rich
Quelles sont
cultural life that Beirut
les
had?
suggestions que vous
What
avez aujourd'hui,
suggestions
les
do you
idées
have today?
que
What
vous avez? Et
ideas do
donc,
you have?
justement, quel rôle pensez-vous que
And
l'UNESCO
what role do
pourrait
you
jouer
think UNESCO
pour vous
might play
accompagner dans cet effort que
in
vous
making
avez
those
commencé
efforts that you have
faire,
begun
parce que
to
vous
make?
voulez rester vous êtes dans ces
Because
quartiers affectés et
you are
vous
in those
pensez qu'il
neighborhoods
faut
which have
absolument
been so
un
impacted,
retour
and
des musées
you say that museums
pour la
need
vie culturelle de Beyrouth.
to get
Alors,
back to
qu'est-ce que vous
work
pouvez nous dire
for
là-dessus,
Beirut's cultural
Suzy?
life. So what can you tell us about that? Beginning with Suzy. Well, the first thing I'd like to say is that museums need to go on existing. That's very important. Our partners are in a very difficult financial situation. I think people think that museums are institutions that belong to rich people, but that's not true. Lebanese museums are great because of their collections, but are very poor institutions. And the 8 museums that have been affected are all private institutions. So that's also a matter of great concern, as you explained. Families live on the work that they do in museums. And then families that visit museums have to have enough work to be able to afford to go to them. This has been a difficult situation for a long time. Now, visits are beginning to be organized again. We need a cultural policy to be set up. We can't go on as we were. Everyone here belongs to the private sector. It's the private sector which is playing this role and which creates cultural life in Lebanon. And the private sector is also the most impacted by this explosion and by this economic crisis. So we need to do everything possible so that the private sector can go on playing its role. And for that to happen, I'm not here talking about subsidies. That's not what interests me. I'm talking about getting things organized, making the sector able to go on living and creating the platform that was Beirut and that everyone knew.
Merci beaucoup. Et c'est vraiment important cette suggestion, effectivement, de travailler sur les politiques culturelles pour justement permettre et aux musées publics et aux musées privés de continuer d'exister. Et j'ai beaucoup aimé le fait que vous ayez bien dit que les musées sont grands par leur collection et petits par leurs moyens. C'est important que l'on le prenne en compte. Et vous, Anne-Marie, allez-y.
Oh yeah, just one more thing. What I expect from UNESCO is that help. I expect UNESCO to be with us, helping us to establish a true cultural policy.
Merci beaucoup pour le message est entendu.
Thank you very much. That
Alors,
message has been heard
qu'est-ce
loud
que
and
vous
clear.
pouvez nous dire?
Anne-Marie, what can you tell us? I'd go back a bit, perhaps, into the past to tell you about the destruction which we tend to forget, but we lived through other periods of terrible destruction as well. And it took us many years between the 1990s and 2016. Just to give you an example of our National Museum, it took more than 40 years to rebuild that museum. And to go back now to UNESCO's role and the help UNESCO could give us, you know that there are universal criteria and which apply to museums and to artworks in general. There are 2 imperatives which need to be met. One is to protect, and here I think everyone recognizes that. Everyone is trying to protect and our collections as well as they can. And then the second is to promote. And here, I think we have difficulties. This is the weak point. Today, it is difficult to play a role in promotion when we forget that museums can participate in the quality of life, contribute to cultural development, social development, tourism. And here we find ourselves in a situation where I think this promotional aspect, cultural promotion, is being downplayed. I think that there needs to be policy and dialogue and shared thinking, not just for museums, but working together with art galleries and the cultural sector in general, so as to come up with a policy, which in fact does not exist today, a joint or shared policy for promoting art in Lebanon. Perhaps with UNESCO's help.
Alors, justement, vous avez renforcé un peu
Well, I think you've
ce que
strengthened
Suzy disait,
Susie's message.
et comme vous avez bien dit,
And
et
as
je
you,
suis
I
très
think,
heureux de
very
l'entendre
correctly
parce
said,
que
and I'm very
c'était bien
happy to hear you say
ce
it
que nous étions
because
en train de
it's
discuter
exactly
effectivement
what we
ici,
were
c'est de ne
discussing
pas
here,
dissocier effectivement le
is
travail
not
des
to
galeries
dissociate
d'art
the
et
work
des
of
musées,
art
et de
galleries
prendre
and that of
effectivement ces
museums,
institutions
and
culturelles
to deal with
dans
those
leur
different
globalité.
cultural institutions as a
Et
whole.
cette politique qui
And
pourrait se
this
faire, qui se veut
policy,
ambitieuse, devrait
which
aller effectivement
could be carried
dans
out,
ce
which should be a
sens-là.
far-reaching one,
Merci
could run
beaucoup.
along those
Alors,
lines.
Zena,
Thank you very much.
et
Zena,
vous, je sais que
what do you think?
vous avez beaucoup d'idées, vous
I know you have many
vous avez
ideas.
échangé, je vous ai écouté personnellement.
We've had
Qu'est-ce
personal
que vous pouvez nous
exchanges.
dire?
I've listened to you with interest. But what can you tell us here today? Well, I was also going to say that it's very important not just to talk about museums. Museums are part of a landscape, a cultural landscape, which is, in our case, a very rich one. And something very unique in Beirut is the nature of these associations, these museums, which at a given point almost flip their roles. There are galleries which for a long time played the role of cultural centers and are still doing that. There are art galleries which are almost nonprofit associations. There are museums today whose role in society in general, since we've been lucky enough to be able to think about a museum's role, a museum for modern contemporary art in our place in Beirut when it reopens, will also to be play the role of a cultural center. A museum is a public space which brings people together. And I think what's important here is that we go on doing better and that we not forget that museums are part of a cultural landscape, as you said yourself. And perhaps that museums could be more visible at difficult times, like right now, could play a role bringing people together, just as institutions like UNESCO do, I think. Museums also need to reflect not only on the preservation of their collections and on rebuilding their very walls, but to do things we've been thinking about since we've been able to gather our thoughts, is to see how museums can help their direct community, like collectors who have a lot of damage in their collections, art galleries and other artistic centers. And I think in the longer term, we also have a role to play in preserving the public spaces that we are in a society and a country that has less and less of these, and where there is a risk that we are going to lose more and more freedom of expression, and I think we have a very important role to play there as well.
Vous avez dit quelque chose de,
yes, you've said something
de vraiment fondamental, c'est aussi
very basic importance
comment dans ce paysage que vous avez décrit aussi,
that you have described,
vous, en tant qu'institution culturelle, donc musée, pouvez aussi, entre vous, apporter un plus ensemble, créer en fait cette communauté d'espaces culturels
a community of
parce qu'on
cultural
dit
spaces.
qu'il faut se souder les coudes en fait pour encore résister, et ça c'est extrêmement bien, c'est fondamental. Et bien sûr, l'UNESCO, comme vous le dites, peut aussi jouer ce rôle de facilitateur pour que justement ce soit possible. Donc, ça peut être très intéressant qu'on retienne l'idée de continuer en fait ce débat sur un thème comme celui-là pour définir un peu comment est-ce que ce type de politique, ce type de facilitation peut être possible dans l'environnement actuel, et en se basant sur les efforts que les uns et les autres sont en train de mener. Merci beaucoup. Et moi, je voudrais maintenant me tourner vers Naila, parce que justement, et puis Saleh et Jumana, vraiment, vous avez, et puis André, vous avez, comment voyez-vous aujourd'hui l'avenir de vos galeries d'art? Comment le voyez-il? Vous avez déjà un petit peu parlé de cette question, vous avez exprimé vos inquiétudes, vos préoccupations, mais quel rôle vous pensez que l'UNESCO peut jouer pour vous accompagner afin que vous retrouviez ou que vos galeries retrouvent leur place prépondérante dans la vie culturelle de Beyrouth? Je vais commencer par Naila.
In Beirut's cultural life. Let me start with Naila. Let me say, first of all, that between art galleries there is a considerable degree of solidarity. I'm thinking certainly of Jumana and Saleh and the Janis Lopez Gallery. We have worked together to try to help some of our artists to be more visible. We did this, and I think we'll go on doing it with great pleasure. What we need now, in fact, is to be able to help our Lebanese artists and other Arab artists that we work with to find platforms elsewhere. Because as André said, Lebanese young people are leaving, those who are able to do so. And this is a terrible thing. But I think we can try to show people elsewhere in the world all of the beautiful things that Lebanese creators make. I've already had offers from major galleries abroad to work together. They even proposed their own spaces to do some work. Obviously, there will always be difficulties of logistics and of money because we'll need to export, but I think these are problems that we can solve. For me, UNESCO's essential role is not directly linked to what we might call culture today, but rather it's their educational role. Schools need to be protected at any cost. Education, especially for art in all its different forms, needs to exist in our school and should not be neglected for different reasons. You know that most students work online now, and it's more and more difficult for parents to ensure that their children are educated in this middle class, which is disappearing by the day in our country. People are constantly asking for laptops and other forms of computers so that their children can do their classwork from home. And so I think that within all this that I'm describing, over and above practical assistance, I think UNESCO needs to work with all different kinds of schools and to encourage those schools not to close down cultural education. Talking about culture in general, history, we've done quite a lot. There are many movements that have sprung up spontaneously. And some museum directors have said here, we have many schools, whether it's the National Museum or elsewhere, who come from the whole region to visit. And I know this because I'm very close to the National Museum. Sometimes I work in the gift shop there. And I've seen schools send kids from all over to bathe in this very ancient culture, which is ours. Exactly how that can happen, I don't know. I don't have a turnkey strategy to offer you, but I know that it's very important to go on encouraging education. People are saying, I'm going to send my children to school abroad. Nothing is happening here. It's all finished. And that's terribly, terribly sad.
Oui, vous avez raison, Naila, parce
you're
que
right, Naila,
je vais dire que vous avez tapé
I
dans
need
le
to
mille
say that, that was a bullseye.
en soulignant cette question importante qu'est
Emphasizing that very
l'éducation
important
artistique,
issue
parce
of
qu'elle est
artistic
vraiment
education,
au centre
because
aussi de l'action de
that
l'UNESCO
is
et
the
du
very
secteur de la
center of
culture. Je crois que
UNESCO's action
Ernesto
and of the
Ottone
cultural sector.
vous
I'm
a
sure
bien
that
écouté,
Ernesto
puisque c'est
Ottone
aussi une
has
des
listened
questions sur
attentively to
lesquelles
this because that
il
was one of
travaille
the
beaucoup. Et je
issues
crois
that he
qu'on a
works on to a
l'opportunité
very
avec
large extent, and I think we have a
cet
possibility
effort
in
que l'on essaye de
these
mettre ensemble
efforts that
pour
we're trying to
le
make, all
Liban,
of us
cette
together,
réponse
for
culturelle
Lebanon, to have this
qui peut être
cultural
envisagée
response,
aussi de
which
considérer
also
cet
could be
aspect,
envisaged,
travailler avec les écoles.
this aspect of
Merci de
working
nous
together with
avoir rappelé,
schools. Thank
rappelé
you
cela
very
parce
much
que
for
c'est
reminding us of
l'aspect
that,
fondamental en
because
fait de tout
it is
cet
the
effort.
fundamental hope
Alors,
of all of these efforts.
Saleh, à vous maintenant de nous donner aussi votre point de vue sur ces questions.
If you can give us your point of view on these questions. So when we started our conversation with the Leila Resed, who I would like to thank for setting up all of this with UNESCO, it was always in order to see how we could, how one could support the institutions and the artists. But I always wanted to tell Leila that actually, speaking about all my colleagues who talked about the artistic landscape, I'd like to talk about an ecosystem. And it's true that every time one has to talk about galleries, we're sort of like the poor relative. No one wants to help the galleries because galleries are rich. But for years, galleries have been suffering. Galleries are also those who employ people, they look after artists, but that's not everything. There's a whole ecosystem. Why only help museums? Why only help artists? One also has to help the art critic who suffered in these explosions, or this art restaurant, or rather art restorer. One has to help the whole ecosystem because so many different people work in the world of art. You also have to help collectors who've lost many things as well. So for me, UNESCO today can have an essential role to maybe go further than the very specific case of galleries. But what is really at stake here is the Levantine identity that this city around the port really represents, this multi-confessional, multi-ethnic city that is open to the West, that is open to the East, that's open to capitalism and to communism as well. It's a country that's religious on the one hand, but that's also very secular on the other. This is a city that is multifaceted and very diverse, that proves to all of humanity then one can live together in times where you can see that fanatism, radicalism, nationalism is rising, protectionism is rearing its head, all these things that make it difficult to live together. But Beirut really is an example that shows that, yes, it is possible to live together. And it's something that's very rich, very important, and has to be preserved. So we have to support the institutions, of course. Museums need your help. They need money, of course, because in this country, unfortunately, there is a total lack of a Ministry of Culture, of an efficient Ministry of Culture. Unfortunately, in the last two governments, there were political appointments for the cultural ministry, and the minister was completely absent. In reality, there was no cultural ministry. Today, the minister is a minister of agriculture who also plays the role of cultural minister, but he's never really been a culture minister. He's not really interested in that. He hasn't even thought of looking at what's happened in the cultural sector, which was completely impacted by all of this. So we've always lived without a cultural ministry, and so we'll be able to survive, but institutions need support. Artists need support. Artists, for example, need to be able to travel. They need to be able to have residencies abroad. Perhaps one also needs to help foreign artists come and do residencies in Lebanon, because this exchange is incredibly important. We need to help the whole of the ecosystem, because it is a platform that is very important, not only for Lebanon and the Middle East, but for the entire world in its diversity. So I'd like to ask you, today we really need financing to be able to defend this platform of freedom that's named Beirut, and which today is in a rather pitiful state. Thank you very much.
Merci beaucoup,
Thank
Saleh.
you very much, Saleh.
Votre plaidoyer,
your appeal.
C'est vrai, c'est pas la première fois qu'on entend
It's true. It's not the first time that
cela, et
we've
je crois
heard this,
on l'a même entendu quand même les ministres de la culture eux-mêmes se sont réunis pour réfléchir sur les conséquences de la pandémie de la Covid. C'est vrai, les ministères de la culture sont souvent des parents pauvres. En fait,
ministers of culture are often the poor relatives of all of this.
C'est une nécessité de travailler ensemble.
And it's a necessity to work together. So politicians have to be there, but also the whole ecosystem, as you said.
C'est plutôt cela qu'il faut regarder.
So that's what one really has to look at today, and we hope.
Dès que le cadre institutionnel va aussi se mettre en place, beaucoup de choses pourront également continuer à se faire. Mais du côté de l'UNESCO, avec vous, on va continuer. Et comme vous voyez, nous sommes engagés avec la délégation permanente du Liban auprès de l'UNESCO pour continuer à aller de l'avant dans ce sens-là. Je retiens cet écosystème dont vous parlez, l'écosystème culturel, il est fondamental, surtout en cette période de Covid.
Ecosystem, which is so fundamental in the present situation, and it's even more important right now to help Lebanon stand up after this trauma, so that cultural life can go on, and that's what we're working on, thanks to the different suggestions that we've heard today.
Il ne nous reste pas beaucoup de temps, mais je sais qu'il y a le public qui nous a écoutés, qui vous a écoutés, qui voudrait ça. Mais avant, je voudrais aussi demander à André quand même de nous donner également son avis sur la question. Alors André, on vous écoute.
En fait, moi je pense que l'art, la scène culturelle est le produit de toute une société.
Is the product of the whole of society.
I
would not like us Lebanese to find ourselves in a position where we have to ask for help. I would like us to be able to go back to be able to stand up by ourselves, to be able to fight for ourselves. So I think that the role of UNESCO, in my opinion, I don't know how you're going to help us in this sense, but as I said before, we need to be liberated. Help us to liberate ourselves and give the Lebanese people the possibility to express themselves. I hope that the new Prime Minister will manage to establish a government. Maybe you could assist in this. I don't know if you can do this, but if you can, do it so that we can be able to stand up by ourselves. We don't want to beg. We don't want to be actors. We want to be able to do things on the international scene. So give us wings. That's what we really need.
Merci beaucoup. Vraiment, le message est clair. Vous ne voulez pas être des bénéficiaires, vous voulez être les acteurs de votre propre
just
développement.
be a beneficiary, you want to be the
C'est ça
actors
qui
of
est
your
important.
own
Et je pense que c'est ce
destiny.
message-là
That's
qui
what's
confirme
important, and this message
ce que
really
nous avons dit au
confirms what
début,
we said at the
c'est-à-dire que
beginning.
ce pays, par son vivier
And
culturel,
that
par
is
sa
that this
diversité
country, by
culturelle, par
its
le fait que
cultural
c'est un
diversity, its
carrefour culturel
cultural wealth,
entre
by the fact
l'Europe
that it's
et
a
le
cultural crossroads
Moyen-Orient, a
between
fait
Europe and
naître
the Middle East,
beaucoup de
that
grands
this
intellectuels
country
de cette planète. Et c'est cet
gave
exemple
birth
que
to
vous
so many
continuez
great intellectuals on our
de nous
planet, and
donner
this is
aujourd'hui.
the
Et
example that
bien
you've
sûr,
repeated
c'est avec
over and
vous
over today. And of course,
que le
it
Liban
is with
va apporter cette réponse culturelle
through you that
que
Lebanon is going to be able to
l'UNESCO
find the cultural
essaye
answers that
de
UNESCO is
comprendre.
trying
Et
to
on le
understand.
fera de toute façon
And
ensemble.
we
Merci
will
beaucoup
work on this
de nous
together.
avoir
Thank you
apporté
very much for
cet
having given
éclairage
us
important.
this
Alors,
important
il y a des
testimony.
questions du
There
public.
are some questions
Mais
from the
comme il ne nous reste
audience,
plus beaucoup de temps,
but since we don't have
je voulais
much
simplement
time, I
une
just
question
wanted
et je vais
to
demander
ask one
à
question,
deux d'entre vous
which
peut-être de
I'll
nous
ask
apporter
maybe two of you
ces réponses d'ailleurs.
to
Donc,
answer
c'était une
this
question qui
question.
concerne
So
les
it's a
jeunes parce que
question
beaucoup de
about
jeunes nous suivent.
youth, because many
Et la
young
question
people
était
are
très claire,
following us, and the
c'est-à-dire que
question is
quel
very
rôle nous les
clear. What
jeunes
is the
nous
role
devrions
that
jouer dans la
young people
reconstruction
can
des
play
galeries
in
d'art
the
de Beyrouth?
reconstruction
Alors je me
of
tourne
Beirut's art
directement vers
gallery? So
Joumana
I'll directly
parce que vous
turn
leur
towards
accordez une place
Jumana,
importante. Est-ce que vous
because
pouvez leur
you
répondre? Ils vous
work
écoutent.
with youth. You can maybe answer them. Yes, absolutely. We need the youth. It is them who are going to help us. It is them who are going to carry us. They have a crucial role. And there are loads of young people who cannot leave Beirut, lots of young people who don't have the means to leave, lots of amazing people, and they are the wealth, they are what constitutes the wealth of our city. Everything begins with the youth. They're the whole artistic scene. And I'll say what was said before me, education is really important. And as Saleh said, UNESCO has a crucial role to play in this field. And that's something we have to work on. We need to help young people to be able to continue so that they can continue doing things, so they can continue living and expressing themselves. And it's all of this is very important, especially expression, so they can express themselves, give them the means, the possibility to express themselves, because they are going to give us all this newness that we need. It's really, really crucial.
Merci beaucoup. Et peut-être en quelques mots, je vais aussi donner la parole à Naila qui est effectivement une des doyennes. Qu'est-ce que vous pouvez leur dire, Naila?
On this point, what would you like to answer to the youth? We all need young people. And I'm trying to keep a program for young people in our gallery. We started having lots of young people who were maybe not all collectors, but they were interested in the work that we were doing, interested in video work or any kind of work. So I don't usually do so, not so much painting, but I found very positive answers with the young people, especially since we're a gallery just like any other gallery that's open to everyone, to all sorts of artists, be them video artists, painters, photographers, wherever they come from. The essential thing for us is that they have a message that they carry. And we did a lot of virtual work over the last year because of COVID, work that we did in Europe first, but then in Lebanon as well. And young people have been looking at everything we're doing virtually, and this is something that is very important. Now, of course, we also have to, the artists will have to earn a living through this, but that is our work. It's not anyone else's work. But without the youth, there is no culture. Youth is what helps us and what drives us forward in our activities.
Merci beaucoup. Il y a beaucoup de questions. Il y a même des questions sur le rôle des musées. Et nous sommes obligés malheureusement d'aller vers la conclusion. Et nous allons essayer quand même de vous faire passer ces questions pour votre information. Nous allons essayer de répondre à certaines d'entre elles, puisqu'elles sont vraiment importantes. Mais ce que je voulais vous dire, effectivement, c'est que je voulais d'abord remercier tous ces auditeurs auditeurs qui nous
first of all, I'd
suivent
like
et
to thank our
qui ont
audience
posé
who's been
toutes ces,
following us and who
tous ces-
asked
toutes
all
ces
these
questions. Donc,
questions.
comme nous sommes en train d'arriver donc à
And
la fin de
since
ce
we're
deuxième
nearing the
débat,
end of this second
je voudrais
debate,
vraiment aussi
I would
beaucoup
also
vous remercier,
very much like
vous,
to thank you,
nos panélistes qui avez accepté
all
d'être là,
of
mais aussi tous
our
vos confrères
panelists, and
et toutes les
also
institutions
I'd like to thank all
qui nous
your
suivent
colleagues
aujourd'hui,
and all the institutions that are following
à qui
us
on n'a pas
today,
pu donner la parole, mais nous aurons, j'espère,
who we couldn't
l'opportunité
give
de
the
le
floor to,
faire
but we hope to be able to
à
in the
d'autres
future,
moments pour continuer
in
à
order to
aller un peu plus
continue
loin sur les idées
to
que
go
vous
a
nous
bit
avez
further to develop these
suggérées
ideas that you
sur,
have suggested to us
sur ce que vous souhaitez
today,
faire. Nous avons
on
beaucoup
what you
apprécié
want
la
to be done.
sincérité de
We
vos
really
propos,
appreciated the
les
honesty of
priorités,
your
les
words,
préoccupations
your priorities,
que
your
vous avez
worries,
eues, vos incertitudes,
your
vos craintes,
uncertainties, your
vos
fears,
bouleversements. Je peux utiliser beaucoup de
all
mots.
these things that have
Et
overwhelmed you,
aussi la colère que certains
but
d'entre vous ont
even also
exprimée, cette
your
colère
anger, the
intérieure,
anger that you've expressed,
qui est
some of you have
aussi celle
expressed
qui vous
today, this
permet
inner
d'aller certainement de
anger
l'avant
that
et de nous
also
montrer cette
drives
forte
you forward.
résilience que l'on connaît
And
du
this really
peuple
shows this resilience that we
libanais.
know so well,
Suzy,
this
comme
resilience
vous
of the
l'avez
Lebanese
dit,
people. Suzy, as you
il y a un lien
said,
viscéral
there
entre
is
les
a
musées et la
visceral
société.
link
Je crois que c'est
between
quelque chose que l'on doit
society and
retenir, qui va être
museums, and I think that
effectivement
is something that we need to remember,
une leçon
because this
que vous
is
nous avez
a
apportée
lesson that
ce
you've
soir, parce
taught
qu'il
us
n'y a
this
pas que la
evening,
culture qui puisse
because
écrire
it's
une histoire
not
inclusive
just
du Liban et
culture that can
rebâtir
write
le
an
pays.
inclusive culture of
Parce que
Lebanon
seule la
and rebuild
culture
the
peut
country, because
rassembler toutes
only
les strates de
culture
la
can bring
société
together all the
du
different
Liban,
strata
peu
of
importe les
society,
différences religieuses, politiques
regardless of
et même
religious, political differences
économiques. Et
or
donc,
economic differences.
les explosions qu'il y a eu le 4 août dernier, c'est
that
vrai, ont été un
rocked
choc
Beirut on the 4th
supplémentaire
of August
dans
were
ce
an
secteur
added shock
des institutions
in
culturelles
this
qui sont essentiellement aussi
environment
les
of cultural
musées
institutions,
et les galeries
the
qui avaient déjà
museums, the art
été
galleries,
fortement
this
affaiblis par
sector that was already
la
severely
pandémie de la
weakened by
COVID,
the
par les mesures
COVID-19 pandemic
de confinement.
and the
Je me rappelle,
lockdown
je retiens
measures.
aussi que dans les mots de Joumana, vous avez
Jumana
dit
also
que et
said
avec la succession des crises de la dernière
that
année,
it is
c'est
with the
comme si on
succession of the
éteignait la
crisis of the
lumière. Et
last
ça,
year, it is as if
je veux
someone were
rappeler ça,
turning the
cette
lights
lumière, on ne
off.
sait pas si elle va s'ouvrir au
And we
passé
don't
noir
know
dans lequel on
when the light will
retrouve.
come
Mais
back.
oui,
We're
nous allons tout
in
faire
darkness, but we'll
ensemble.
do
Et
everything
nous pensons
together.
qu'il faut réallumer cette
And we think that we really have to turn the light
cette lampe
back on,
imaginaire ou
this
cette lampe
imaginary
pour
lamp.
redonner effectivement cette lumière qu'il
need to bring
faut.
light
J'ai aussi
back.
retenu ce que Naila nous a dit, que la
Naila
seule
also
chose que l'on
mentioned that
peut
the
faire dans un
only
état de
thing that we
désolation
can do
actuel
in
est quelque
the
part un
present
peu de
state of
se
desolation
réinventer.
is to reinvent
Oui, il faut se
oneself.
réinventer. C'est
Yes,
aussi
one
ça
has
la
to
force
reinvent
quand
oneself. That is also a strength
résilient. Et
when
cet
one is
engagement
resilient.
est fort et ça
And
exprime
this
aussi
commitment is
votre
strong,
détermination.
and this really
Et
shows
tout
your
cela est encourageant.
determination. And all of this is quite
Et c'est très
encouraging
positif.
and very
Et je sais
positive.
aussi, et ça je voulais dire, parce que Anne-Marie, vous l'avez dit, vous nous avez
And
rappelé
Anne-Marie,
que même
you
si,
reminded us
par
that
exemple, les bâtiments
even if
sont rebâtis,
the buildings are rebuilt,
les musées libanais vont
the
peut-être
Lebanese
souffrir de ce que
museums
vous avez
may
appelé
suffer
cette
from what
vulnérabilité
you
chronique
call this
qui doit être
chronic
quand même prise en compte
vulnerability that has to be taken
dans ce
into
processus de
account in
réflexion
this
pour le retour à la vie
reflection
culturelle.
process in order to be
Et donc,
able to
et c'est
come back to
pourquoi c'était
cultural life.
fondamental
And
que
that's why it
vous
was
nous rappeliez
fundamental
qu'une
for
des
you to
choses que
remind us that
l'UNESCO
one of
peut
the things that
faire
UNESCO
aujourd'hui,
can do
c'est de
today
travailler à
is
cette
to work
politique culturelle, ce cadre
on
de
these
politique
cultural
culturelle
policies,
qui
on
peut
the
être important, mais
framework, the
l'UNESCO ne peut
cultural
pas le faire
framework
sans
that
vous.
is so
Je crois
important.
que
And UNESCO
notre
can't do this
sous-directeur
without you.
général
I
Ernesto
think
Otone,
our Assistant Director
qui lui
General
a été
Ernesto
à Beyrouth,
Otone,
qui a
who
parlé avec vous,
went
qui a
to
échangé
Beirut and who
avec vous,
spoke to
est
you,
certainement très conscient de ce
I think
besoin
he is very conscious of these
et on va
needs.
continuer à
And we will
travailler
continue to work
là-dessus et
on this.
il nous en parle déjà, donc on
He's
va
already
continuer à
been talking to
travailler
us
et
about
avec
this,
nos
so we will
collègues du bureau
continue
de Beyrouth aussi
working on this
pour aller
together with our colleagues in the
là-dessus. Ce
Beirut
qui émerge
Bureau.
avant tout sur les témoignages que nous vous avons, que vous nous avez vous avez partagé avec nous ce soir, c'est que l'ampleur de cette stratégie nécessite une réponse globale. Et ça, c'est fondamental. C'est vrai, on parle des 8000 bâtiments, on parle des plus de 640 bâtiments d'après, suite à tout le travail formidable, extraordinaire que la Direction générale des Antiquités a mené pour regarder ces questions, des besoins financiers qu'il va y avoir, ces millions de dollars qui sont nécessaires, sur lesquels on va essayer de... On est bien conscient, et je crois que le monde entier est conscient. Et c'est pour ça que cette initiative pour Beirut a encore tout son sens encore aujourd'hui, parce qu'il faut veiller, vous l'avez dit, à ce que l'éducation et la culture occupent une place centrale dans ces efforts de reconstruction. C'est ça le sens de Beirut. Et à vous qui nous avez suivis aussi, membres de ceux qui nous ont écoutés, qui nous ont suivis aussi depuis le Liban et ailleurs, n'hésitez pas à faire des dons sur ce fonds de l'UNESCO, parce que c'est pas pour l'UNESCO, mais c'est pour Beirut. Donc partagez le hashtag Beirut pour Beirut, parce que ce que nous devons faire, nous allons le faire ensemble. Et ce lien est disponible sur le site web de l'UNESCO. Et votre soutien permettra effectivement de rebâtir cette ville multiculturelle, multiséculaire, ouverte, riche, que moi je connais. Je me suis baladé dans les rues de Marmkrel et de Jemaïzé, où je me suis arrêté dans des cafés-librairies pour écouter la musique, lire des belles poésies de grands poètes libanais et autres. Donc je termine donc en vous invitant chaleureusement encore à nous rejoindre. Nous allons continuer la semaine prochaine, le 24 septembre, pour la prochaine édition de notre débat ResiliArt Liban, pour poursuivre notre réflexion, mais cette fois-ci sur le développement de la culture et plus particulièrement aussi sur la question du patrimoine culturel bâti. Merci à vous tous qui nous avez suivis ce soir. Merci encore à vous, chers amis panélistes, pour ce formidable, inoubliable débat que nous avons eu. Merci, et je vous souhaite à tous, au nom de Ernesto Tonelloso, directeur général de la culture, mais aussi son Excellence l'ambassadeur Sarah Bassiri, une très belle soirée malgré tout ce qui se passe à vous là-bas à Beyrouth et au Liban, et aussi à tous qui nous écoutent. À très bientôt.
In Lebanon. And thank you to everyone who's listened to us. Thank you. Goodbye.